Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this globe. We welcome you to this webinar. My name is Dr. Methan Pundu. I'm the director for REACT Africa. We are privileged to have Dr. Scott Newman as a presenter today. He's the delivery manager for FAO's Africa Regional Initiative to Sustainable Production, Intensification, and Value Chain Development, and he's the Senior Animal Health and Production Officer. He's based at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, a regional office for Accra, for Africa in Ghana, I'm sorry. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread across the world and slowly but recently penetrated the African continent, we need to be acutely aware of how the global crisis will affect the world's most resource-constrained countries, many of which are in Africa. As we watch more advanced economies struggling to deal with both the threat to public health and the resulting economic fallout, African countries have little time to spare in anticipating the crisis and how it will affect the national and regional situations. While much attention has been paid globally to the public health implications of the spread of COVID-19, the economic reverberations are likely to be most acutely felt by the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations, of which a substantial portion reside in Africa. With a general global economic shutdown anticipated, along with national and international restrictions on movement and trade, the threat may be most severe to food supply networks, and in Africa will only serve to further exacerbate the existing challenges and risk to food security. In particular, the reverberating economic, trade, and labor implications of the pandemic pose threats to the stability of agri-food value chains in Africa. This will be the focus of the presentation today. Dr. Scott Newman, you are welcome to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murphin, for the very kind introduction. And I want to thank REACT Africa and Africa CDC for the opportunity to present in this webinar series. Due to bandwidth challenges here in Ghana, I think I will say hello and goodbye visually, and I'll switch over to just an audio so I can present and have better clarity of my voice. Murphin, can I take control of the screen so I can share the slideshow?
Yes, please, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, you can go ahead now.
Okay, I don't see the option on my side to share screen yet.
You don't see the option on your side?
Okay, I have it now.
Wonderful. We can see it. Wonderful.
Okay, great. Okay. Since the late 2019, the outbreak of coronavirus disease, COVID-19, has rapidly spread across the world, devastating lives, livelihoods, and economies. To date, the full impact of this virus on food security and agricultural food systems is not really known, and the virus continues to spread across Africa as well globally. Africa now has more than 10 countries with over 1,000 COVID-19 cases reported, and it's suspected that this is really a gross underestimate of what is happening on the continent. Most experts agree that the worst is still to come for Africa, and now is the time to take aggressive action to avert a food crisis on top of the public health crisis. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations is particularly concerned about the potential impacts of the pandemic response on food security and livelihoods of the most vulnerable human populations, and where populations are already experiencing food crises. Many of these locations and vulnerable people are here in Africa. What's becoming clear is that measures to control COVID-19 disease spread are starting to have a significant effect, negative effect that is, on people's livelihoods, food supply chains, and people's access to food. In the presentation, I will cover a brief introduction. I'll talk about FAO's approach to assess the situation at country level in Africa, and also talk about how countries are moving towards mitigating the impacts of COVID-19 on smallholder producers as well as agri-food value chains. I'll summarize the disruptions at farm level, along agri-food value chains, and at markets. And then I'll talk a bit about the policy options to address these disruptions. Finally, I'll speak a bit about the AU, African Union, and FAO virtual ministerial meeting and provide some conclusions. When we look at the global production of major commodities over time, we continue to see an increase in the available amount of major commodities, including maize, rice, soybeans, and wheat. So what we can conclude from this, this historical tracking of these commodities is that we don't really have a food scarcity issue. However, in lieu of the measures that are being put in place to stop transmission of COVID-19, moving the available food to those people in need, and in this case, particularly here in Africa, this is really the challenge that we face. And in the near future, we're also anticipating that local food production may become more challenging, and we'll discuss why in the upcoming slides. Africa before COVID-19. I just want to paint a little picture about the situation here in Africa before we started dealing with COVID-19 at a global level. And I think it's pretty fair to say that we had large numbers of people on the African continent who were hungry, who were food and nutrition insecure, and who were also extremely poor. We recognize that approximately 167 million people are food insecure, 113 million undernourished, millions of children are acutely malnourished and stunted, and there are also roughly 413 million who are extremely poor in sub-Saharan Africa. The second point that I want to make is that the rural poor are closely linked to agricultural livelihoods. And we know that poverty is predominantly in rural places, and that 82% of Africa's poor are rural people earning their living from farming or through agriculture-related activities. We also know that there are many vulnerable people here in Africa. And we recognize that there are over 20 million displaced people, displaced as a result of either civil unrest, climate change, drought, or conflict. As of the 27th of April, 2020, globally, there were over 3 million cases of COVID-19 and over 207,000 deaths. According to WHO, over the past week in Africa, COVID-19 cases have increased by more than 40%. There's a significant concern that the continent of a 1.3 billion people, and the continent which has very fragile and overstretched healthcare systems, as well as large susceptible populations due to prevalence of HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, or other nutritional deficiencies, could become the next epicenter for the global pandemic. In Africa, specifically, there are 31,933 confirmed cases, 1,423 deaths, and 9,566 people who have recovered. To date, the virus has not yet been documented to have spread widely in many countries with severe food insecurity. What this means is that we're really looking at the continued progress of the virus expansion and affecting more and more people and more countries to become more significant over time. Reflecting on past Ebola outbreaks that have taken place here, one would expect food price spikes, significant harvest reductions, and further food insecurity. Africa is largely an import-dependent continent, especially when it comes to food and inputs needed to produce food. With the global economic crisis associated with COVID-19 and the current control measures in place to limit disease spread, there are several concerns. One is that the African countries will have difficulty purchasing food and inputs to support local food production. Second is that restrictions on movement of people, goods, and services will prevent food transport and imports and exports. And finally, that livelihoods and income losses from households will prevent people from being able to purchase food. To evaluate what's actually happening on the ground in countries here in Africa, FAO worked very closely with governments to conduct an initial rapid assessment of the situation. The goal of the assessment was to document COVID-19 related disruptions to producers and agri-food value chains, and to summarize the strategic policies, measures, and interventions that are being taken to mitigate a looming food crisis in respective countries. The information I'll share in the following slides comes from this assessment. Overall, we summarize the different food system disruptions at 3 different levels. We look at impacts at farms, impacts along agri-food value chains, and also impacts at markets. In the next few slides, I'll cover each of these areas. And if you look at the top left of the slide, you can determine whether I'm at a farm along an agri-food value chain or whether I'm at a market. At the farm level, restricted human movement and government-imposed lockdowns on movement are leading to interruptions in the availability of labor, which affects harvest, post-harvest, handling of food, transportation, and storage of food. Rapid harvesting or movement of perishables, whether they be fresh milk, fish, fruit, or vegetables, is always a challenge. But now with a smaller workforce available, there's increased risk of post-harvest losses. Closure of public and private offices are also leading to interruptions in the delivery of advisory and support services to producers, an inability to conduct surveillance and respond to diseases in crops, aquaculture, and livestock. Veterinary and extension services, pest control, and monitoring systems for food safety are no longer as readily available to be implemented. And finally, there's a reduced compliance with some of the quality control and quarantine measures that routinely take place. National and international restrictions, including road closures, closed borders, and limited transportation capacity, is also contributing to the challenges we face. It is preventing agricultural inputs from being delivered to producers and farmers in all sectors. This includes inputs and supplies that are sourced locally and those sourced internationally. Crops and vegetable farmers can't access seed, fertilizers, or agrochemicals and machinery. Fish and aquaculture farmers can't access fishing gear, fuel, medicines, and aquaculture feed. Livestock farmers can't access livestock feed, medicines, and vaccines. The shortage of imported agricultural inputs leads to limited availability and increasing prices for agricultural inputs. This can lead to either one of 2 scenarios. Either farmers pay higher prices for inputs and there are similar production levels, but food prices may increase, or farmers cannot afford the higher priced inputs. Production decreases and there's a reduction in food availability. It's important to note that remote rural localities are most impacted in this case. They're not able to basically maintain seasonal supplies to accommodate the upcoming growing season. Excuse me. FAO is most concerned for West and Central African subregions as their main cropping season starts this coming June. Restrictions on transportation networks and imports are also impacting logistics associated with food production and agro-processors along value chains. Logistic operators, agro-processors, and distributors are unable to secure raw materials and supply value-added products to domestic markets. Agro-processors are also unable to procure spare parts and services for equipment and machinery. And finally, the agro-processors lack available ingredients and inputs for agro-processing, including packaging and labeling materials. It's important to note that these issues will have greater impacts on small to medium agro-processing enterprises who do not usually maintain large stocks and usually cannot pay for service providers during prolonged periods of interruptions. Staying within the agri-food value chains, disruptions to international logistics networks are having impacts on food suppliers, distribution networks, importers, and exporters, including a decrease in food products imported from overseas. This is of particular concern here in Africa, where in some cases, upwards of 90% of consumed food in some countries is typically imported. Low-income and landlocked countries, as well as small island developing states, would be expected to feel this impact most significantly. The second point is that stay-at-home policies that are being implemented decrease the availability of drivers and labor for equipment operators and food transport along food distribution networks. This has national as well as international implications for movement of food. Finally, restricted logistics networks reduce the distribution of processed food products within countries and again across borders. Despite its really very vast agricultural potential, Africa is still a net importer of agricultural products. Roughly 80 billion US dollars worth of products were imported between 2015 and 2017. And over the past 2 decades, imports have been increasing by about 6% each year, consisting mostly of basic foodstuffs such as cereals, vegetables, oil, sugar, meat, and dairy. The vast majority of imports are sourced from outside the region, from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This highlights the importance of African governments needing to speak with their most important trade partners to ensure the flow of goods is maintained. It also demonstrates to some extent how fragile the situation is for Africa and how dependent Africa is on what policies are put in place in other regions around the world. Now we'll take a look at the impacts of COVID-19 on food markets. Closures and restricted operations of open markets, informal markets, and street vendors is happening across Africa. In fact, news is continuing to be filled with recent stories about people being arrested for trying to sell their products during lockdown or for not having the correct permits to be able to sell food during lockdown period. As most of you are aware, the reality for the majority of most people in Africa is that they obtain their food at open markets or food stalls, points of sale to purchase food. Concurrently, there is reduced consumer purchasing power due to the loss of daily wages or livelihoods associated with the stay-at-home policies. This is having the greatest impact on countries where social safety nets are not helping the people who essentially survive and buy food from daily wages they earn.
Dr. Scott, you want to bring back the PowerPoint slide? Sorry, if you can reshare the PowerPoint slide. It dropped off.
Okay. I didn't hear when you dropped out. Hold on one second.
Wonderful.
Okay, I'm not sure what slide we're at, Murphin, when we dropped out.
Oh, go on, I'll let you know. On the value chain distribution.
Do you know, is it this one or the next one?
Let's say the next one. I'll go on. This one was okay. Next one. Yes, we can start with this one. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll splice together two parts. Is that the plan?
Yeah.
Okay. Restrictions on transportation networks and imports are also impacting logistics associated with food production and agro-processors along the value chain. Logistics operators and agro-processors and distributors are unable to secure raw materials and supply value-added products to domestic markets. Agro-processors are unable to procure spare parts and services for equipment and machinery, and agro-processors are also lacking available ingredients and inputs for agro-processing, including packaging and labeling materials. It's important to note that these issues will have greater impact on small to medium agro-processing enterprises because they usually don't maintain large stocks, and they also cannot pay for service providers over a prolonged period of interruption. Staying within the agri-food value chains, disruptions to international logistics networks are having impacts on food suppliers, distribution networks, importers, and exporters, including a decrease in food products being imported from overseas. This is a particular concern here in Africa, where in some cases upwards of 90% of consumed food is typically imported. Low-income, landlocked countries, as well as small island developing states would be expected to feel this impact most significantly. The second point I want to raise is that the stay-at-home policy is decreasing availability of drivers and labor for equipment operators and food transport along food distribution networks. This has implications both nationally and internationally for food movement. And finally, restricted logistics network reduce the distribution of processed foods as well, again, nationally and across borders. Despite its vast agricultural potential, Africa is still a net importer of agricultural products. Between 2015 and 2017, Africa imported roughly 80 billion US dollars worth of imports. Over the past 2 decades, imports have also been increasing by about 6% per year, consisting mostly of basic foodstuffs, including cereals, vegetable oils, sugar, meat, and dairy. The vast majority of these imports are sourced from outside the region, from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And this highlights the importance of African governments needing to speak with their most important trade partners to ensure that the flow of goods are maintained. It also demonstrates how fragile the situation is for Africa and how dependent Africa is on the policies that are put in place even in other areas of the world. Now we'll take a look at the impacts of COVID-19 on food markets. We recognize that closures and restricted operations of open markets, informal markets, and street vendors is happening across Africa right now. In fact, the news is filled recently with people being arrested for trying to sell their products during lockdown or for not having the correct permits to be able to sell food during the lockdown period. As most of you are aware, the reality for the majority of people here in Africa is that they really obtain most of their food at open markets or food stalls and not necessarily at supermarkets. So when these food points of sale are closed, then we really are seeing some challenging situations. What this translates into is that we have reduced access to diverse and healthy, nutritious food for millions of people. And we also are starting to see increased food prices as a result of having limited locations available to purchase food. Concurrently, there's a reduced consumer purchasing power because many people have lost their daily wages or livelihoods associated with the stay-at-home policies. This is having the greatest impact on countries where the social safety nets are not helping those people who essentially survive and buy food from daily wages they earn. If these safety nets do not cover this group of vulnerable people, governments will be placed in a challenging situation of having to choose between relaxing movement restrictions to allow people to earn their wages and income and buy food, knowing that this may result in additional spread of disease, or alternatively, maintaining the lockdown restrictions and pushing more people towards food and nutrition insecurity. We certainly want to avoid this at all costs, and many of the mitigation measures that we're suggesting be moved forward with are trying to prevent this situation from arising at national level. One final point I want to make here is that with fewer available points of sale for food and fewer customers that can afford food, the upstream effect is that there will be loss of income to producers, processors, and all value chain actors. As mentioned before, Africa depends largely on international trade, both for imports and exports, and there will be additional impacts felt in Africa. These types of impacts include reduced intra-African and external export markets available for food producers and processors, impacts to the supply and price of credit, and disruptions to currency exchanges, contributing to inflation and resulting in a limited supply of foreign exchange in African countries. These issues pose major challenges for small and medium enterprises, which are the backbone of agricultural value chains in the logistics, transport, distribution, and processing sectors. There's also a concern that there will be a reduced ability of African countries to financially maintain food imports and imported inputs for food production and processing. There's an increased risk that domestic companies will file for bankruptcy or default for loans. And then there will be the viability of businesses that provide essential production and distribution services across agricultural and food-based value chains. If we look a little more closely, what we can see is that Africa's agricultural exports are dominated mostly by cash crops, things like cocoa, edible fruits, nuts, coffee, tea, spices, fish, and edible vegetables and roots. The global economic downturn is also likely to reduce the demand for African food commodity exports, including cash crops. And this translates into upstream problems with reduced revenues for producers, processors, and exporters. Already there are indications of declining, according to the IMF. With this large set of impacts already being observed at the level of producers, along value chains, and at markets, and knowing that here in Africa, COVID-19 is just starting to embed itself in many countries and cases will continue to increase for months to come, now is really the time to take action to prevent and avert a major food crisis on top of the global pandemic health crisis. In the assessment undertaken by FAO and member country governments, we also evaluated policies being put in place to balance the need for maintaining operational food systems and curbing the spread of disease. Some of the policies that governments are implementing to help maintain functional food systems are listed here. Exemptions on movement restrictions for production or agri-food value chain workers, maintaining services and supporting food systems and production value chains with special environmental measures and ensuring that these monitoring that also allows us to ensure that prices, food prices are stabilized by providing direct subsidies to agricultural producers and processors. And another measure that's being put in place, another policy speaks to social safety net, lost wages and lost livelihood, largely through cash and in-kind food transfers. Some additional country policy interventions include food products and inputs to agri-food supply chains being exempt from import or export restrictions, government guarantee and lending schemes to SMEs in agri-food value chains, protocols for movement of fresh, refrigerated, and frozen products, as well as live animals across borders on trucks, ships, and planes, the use and scale up of digital technologies for payment, purchasing, and delivery of food and agricultural supplies, and finally, flexible and adaptable restrictions. These are just some of the policy interventions that are being made at country level here in Africa to support food systems and maintaining food security. A few specific. In Ghana, production, distribution, and marketing of food are exempt from the movement restrictions, paving a way for continuity of food availability. Ethiopia's National Task Force advised for information and communication technology to cover producer-related extension services, financial services, and enabling Nigeria. They've implemented a broad program for price stabilization of agri-food products, and they're prohibiting export of important staple food crops such as grains to maintain strategic national grain reserves. And in Gabon, Gabon is issuing special permits for entry into the country for food trucks and transport of agricultural supplies and inputs. Knowing that now is the time to act in order to prevent food insecurity and nutrition insecurity associated with the health crisis in Africa, the African Union and FAO organized a ministerial meeting to share information on the situation in Africa and to agree upon a declaration on food security and nutrition during the COVID-19 pandemic, on the need to concurrently contain COVID-19 spread and ensure the measures are in place to support food and nutrition security for all, especially the most vulnerable. While the declaration includes many more points, some of the most important issues are highlighted here. There are significant signs of emerging disruptions at farms upstream and downstream along agri-food value chains and at markets. To date, the emerging crisis is viewed primarily through a public health lens, as it should be, and only gradually are we starting to see a whole of government or One Health or multi recognize that the whole of government approach needs to be accelerated to alleviate a looming food crisis. Efforts to contain the spread of the virus need to be accompanied by measures to minimize disruptions to food systems and agriculture systems. And it's important as well and acknowledge that supporting the livelihoods and food security of the most vulnerable should be one of the top priorities. In starting to wrap up my presentation, I want to reiterate a few important points. I think it's important to highlight that COVID-19 control measures could exert a significant shock to food and nutrition security here in Africa. And then COVID-19 control measures poverty, especially in countries where there are already ongoing crises, and these include countries affected, for example, by desert locusts, countries where there are already high levels of food and nutrition insecurity, and countries that are initial analysis. What we can see is that some good policy options are being applied in some African countries And while these policies help do not see them being applied uniformly across Africa. And they're not adequate to avert the looming crisis as they are now, which means that more has to be done, and it needs to be done soon before the situation worsens. A few important challenges also remain. And to illustrate one of these challenges, I want to play a quick video. This video is illustrating one of the local markets, and it was taken the day before the lockdown was put in place here in Ghana. And I think what is really important to recognize is that we're dependent on going to markets like this for food. This is where people go to access their regular routine food supplies, as well as other things that they need to purchase. And with closure of these types of markets, the impact is very significant. The alternative is that these markets may not be closed in some countries in Africa. And you can see clearly from what's shown here, the real challenge that one would face and social distancing. So I think that in particular, related to these to have access to food at the types of markets that they usually frequent here in Africa, this is really an area that we need to come up with a creative and better solution. The second area where I think we really need to come up with an alternative solution is related to the lockdowns. And we've alluded to it several times, but these lockdowns inflict really enormous hardships on people who depend on income earned each day to be able to feed themselves and their families. And so the lockdown makes a very big challenge for them as far as accessing money and being able to afford food. And so we're really looking at these lockdown measures and how they may push even more people into a severe poverty status or into a more significant food and nutrition insecurity. And so an alternative solution needs to be found. Hopefully social safety nets can be improved and can reach more of this situation, because this is really a very significant reality that we're facing right now. And over the next months, countries have more and more infection, and more measures are needed to try to control disease spread. The advantage is that we know some of the most important issues that we need to address. The question is whether or not we'll be able to find solutions and implement them in time. There are still some unknowns that will ultimately influence the decisions and action. Most importantly, the question is, to what extent will COVID-19 continue to spread here in Africa? The World Health Organization has warned of 10 million cases potentially on the continent within the next 3 to 6 months. What we need to prevent at the same time as managing disease spread is preventing a parallel large-scale catastrophic problem associated with impacts on livelihoods, food supply chains, and people's access to food. Averting this crisis will largely depend on additional measures taken by governments to mitigate the health crisis and at the same time facilitate functional food systems and food security. Whether the global economic slowdown translates into reduction of imported food, the scenario that we need to wait and see. but I think that we know this is a looming challenge, and that we can take measures now to facilitate trade and prevent export limitations, but also facilitate import here in Africa. And then finally, we need to take a look at whether the global economic slowdown will also translate into a reduction in African crops, high value cash crops, as well as other exports. I think that, you know, it's really, we're at a point where we can say that we're in a very difficult situation. The situation is going to continue to get worse. And while we know that we're in a really tough place, we're making very significant changes and taking advantage and turning the situation around. And so now is really the time to seize the opportunities and to prevent a very large potential impact of COVID-19, not just on health and the health of people, but also on their livelihoods and on food and nutrition security here in Africa. FAO will continue to work closely with governments to prevent this food value chains, and to also ensure that social safety nets meet the needs of the most vulnerable. On a global level, there are 4 areas that FAO is focusing on. These include understanding and mitigating the pandemic's impact on food and agriculture, safeguarding food security and livelihoods of the most vulnerable, understanding the virus's origin and spread, and ensuring a unified One Health approach working at the human, wildlife, livestock, and ecosystem interfaces. I want to take a moment to thank the national authorities and the governments in Africa who have worked closely with FAO to identify the important food system disruptions, as well as the policies that they're implementing to address these disruptions. I also want to thank the FAO representative, despite the other many competing interests and challenges that they face at country level. And I also want to thank my colleagues listed here from the FAO regional office here in Africa who supported compilation of this information. Thank you for listening, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this very valuable webinar series. Over to you, Murphin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for the excellent presentation. We are very, very grateful for it. So on behalf of REACT Africa and the Africa CDC, I want to say thank you so much, and we will take some questions. Thank you, and bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Look forward to the questions.